This is a reading of my final term paper for the fall 2016 Philosophy of Ethics at El Centro College, titled American Poverty and Our Ethical Standard, read by myself, Matthew Steadman. You cannot fix a problem until you acknowledge it is there to be fixed. Many times in the society of the United States, it appears it takes an issue getting to a certain measure of impending doom before we take the action to fix a problem. When you are dealing with issues that come up on the ethical spectrum, it is time we collectively make a change in our actions. The first task is to just generate more ideas. You can even treat it as a pure question of quantity. It is a helpful and eye-opening practice just to try and get, say, 10 ideas on the table before thinking at all about which ones to choose. The quote by Anthony Weston in A Practical Companion to Ethics. But looking around at American society today, it seems that we are not even attempting to generate one or two scenarios that could improve the issue. And yet, there are many. My focused proposal is that we in American society have reached, in our current poverty levels and statistics, an unethical standard, and more so that it seems we are okay with the standard and only rarely speak about it as if it has become some sort of taboo topic among the citizens. With the poverty rate hovering at 16% and rising, and child poverty being 1 in every 4 children, I think it is only fair to say we have an issue staring us directly in the face and yet continue to beat around the bush, as the old saying goes, in tackling the issue. But first, we must set the scope in which we will discuss the issue and base the claim that it is an issue in itself. Rebecca Neuberger wrote in her essay for the Templeton Foundation series, Does Moral Action Depend on Reasoning?, that it is our nature of persisting that causes us to act in an unethical way. It refers to how one person, someone other than myself, ought to behave towards another person. She eloquently describes a scene on a beach in which she is lying down to get a suntan, and another person walks over her, and her outrage at his blatant disregard for her own welfare. The quarrel ending with her exclaiming to the other person, "What is wrong with you?" The quarrel ending with her exclaiming to the other person, "What is wrong with you that you did not see a reason to behave differently?" It is understood also through Miss Neuberger's writing that she does not view the feeling of outrage as an obstacle or weakness, but one that drives us to a moral and ethical action. I completely agree with her that in that it is only seems correct, looking at history, that it was outrageous actions, either being done or not done, that sparked some of our biggest movements, even in our own country's recent history, including women's rights, abolishment of Jim Crow, and more recently the United States Supreme Court's ruling on same-sex marriage. But I also bring to attention that sometimes our outrage and disgust is not always at the right time, but rather when it has come to such an obvious problem that we finally feel that something must and will change. I do find one issue with the statements of Miss Neuberger, in that she states and explains that the sympathy aspect comes naturally and is directed at the members and persons of one's own group. I do agree that there is naturally an aspect that we are predisposed to focus, care on others in our group, but I also agree that the awareness that those in the human category can also feel a wide variety of emotions, not only for their own group, race, sex, sexual orientation, nationalism, etc., but also the most bare humanist view of humanity in general. In that, I feel her comment could be misconstrued by readers to stagnate the point and bring a type of solidarity for their own exemption of taking action for the issue of poverty, especially for our own country, nationalism. But as another author in the Does Moral Action Depend on Reasoning series states, Jonathan Sacks points out that even Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection brings an aspect of focusing on oneself. even spurring Richard Dawkins' term of the selfish gene. Mr. Sachs continues to explain and expound on the aspect of what he terms the Nazi consciousness, in which any action must first be dubbed good before it is done, whether it truly is in the good of humanity or not. He explains it as a type of crux of the Homo sapiens that we have the issue of the neuroscience, the working of the prefrontal cortex that in a way controls our humane actions and feelings and how we continue on. Although you could read both the words of Miss Neuberger and Mr. Sachs as opposing, and in many ways they are, I find it comforting to see that they both come to the conclusion that humans, Homo sapiens, have a direction to do what is right, whether that be innately known or told by religious texts or the like. For the Templeton Foundation's project, even though the many authors seem to have varying and different ideas of how to get to a moral action and the reasoning, nonetheless we eventually get there, whether around or under. For this piece, I will make the assumption that morality and ethics are dependent on reasoning, whether we get them from the ways in which we see our groups or the mere fact of basic humanitarian needs. We must look into our ethical toolbox of utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics, care theory, proximate and cosmopolitan, to find a beginning guidance to our issue. In utilitarianism, we find that the action of helping those in poverty come out of poverty is either an action we would label good or bad. It would be a hard-won case to argue that doing such a thing would be bad. So we must admit that using utilitarianism, we have a moral obligation to change the issue of poverty in our country. Then, looking to deontology, we see the focus shifted to an idea of, is this something I would have others do? And again, if I were in the place of poverty, I would only come to the conclusion that it would be right, just, and moral to take action against the issue. Even for myself, one being not in poverty, I think it only right that I would have myself and others begin a change of how poverty is handled in our country. In virtue ethics, we see this focus shift again around to what society would see as a virtuous act, and we are again against the wall in the action of doing something. And I will propose it must be something drastic to do the virtuous action in regards to poverty. And lastly, in care theory, both proximate and cosmopolitan, we are faced with the same daring issue. In the proximate way, it is ethical that those around me in my network be in poverty? No. And in the cosmopolitan view, is it right that those in my city, in my country, are living in poverty? Again, no. So using our ethical toolbox, we are very bluntly and blatantly, in a way, nailed to the wall of lacking in doing something in regards to poverty, not even in the broad scope of the world, but our own first world country, which has no excuse to have poverty rate that it does, especially if we use the ethical toolbox to come to the conclusion. We are then left with a national humanitarian problem of poverty seeping into our cities and streets. No matter what part of the nation you live, with a 17% gap of poverty in the workings, it is not hard to come across the issue in almost, I would claim, any city. And on the basis we have made in the statements above, it is time as a society and country that we make the standard we have been living by and start a change. It seems philosophers are currently shying away from the topic, especially when looking for works in the latest front. With a growing issue growing by the day, you would assume to find up-to-date, almost daily works being churned out, or the writing press, yet the press are quite and still in the moment. Some speak of it, but in very broad terms, and most are from even a few years ago. So for my sources, in the following statements, if there is an update in the figure stated, I will annotate it accordingly, still giving the author full credit for the proposition and ideas. For this section, I will delve into some basic items of housekeeping that we need to do socially and politically within our society that would, at bare minimum, help the situation we currently have. I will glean knowledge and information from others who are well versed in the specifics of societal changes that can do and be done to help in our current state. I would, of course, logically deduce and from my own opinions, but for this piece, I will keep it in a type of collaborative approach. And in so doing, the two biggest factors that I can see that would directly impact poverty in our country would be 1. Raising the minimum wage to help the poor, and 2. Government programs should be more tailored to America's poor. Although this is not an essay in regards to specific governmental and political changes and suggestions, I do believe these two issues historically become intertwined in our ethical policy for eradicating poverty in our country. As Holly Sklar points out, the federal minimum wage was enacted during the Great Depression in 1938 to promote economic recovery, and it succeeded in doing just that. Even President Franklin Roosevelt called the minimum wage, quote, an essential part of economic recovery. It was enacted in a way to put a beam underneath the workers to assist them in being able to purchase goods and boost the economy. Before this action, workers were paid dismal wages to work and then still continue to live in poverty at a stricken state. Logically, if there is less money going out into the workforce, that would mean there is less money there to come into the capitalist and business owner. Thus, I believe a basic matter in the attempts to levy the poverty level would be to increase the minimum wage. It should be at minimum a wage that if a worker worked for what our society considers a normal work week, 40 hours, that person could continue to live adequately. This should not be confused as saying that in a sense all workers should be paid the same no matter what job. Not at all. But at the very least, in an ethical, democratic society, I would hope that if a person was putting in a normal work schedule, they would be being compensated adequately. In the case this does not happen, we are not only setting our brothers and sisters in poverty to continue failing, but also we are narrowing down the money being churned into society that can be flipped over and returned to those employing the employees. It is not as if by giving a higher wage the money would then disappear and become useless. No professional economist would even make that claim. As Franklin Roosevelt pointed out, it is critical not only for fighting poverty but spurring economic growth. Without a buyer, the seller is of no use. And it must be said that within the American economy, the consumer spending makes up roughly 70% of the economy in itself. So to disregard filtering in monetary gains for the majority of society is to put knowledgeable, susceptible issues that is bound to rise. In such a case, I see it hard to come to the conclusion that putting in actions to eradicate and attempt to end, or at very least reduce the poverty level in our country, it can only turn around and grow more consumers and bring in more economic profit. It is a cycle that is endless, but without one aspect, the tower collapses. And as it is stated by Miss Scarler, the United States is an increasingly shaky superpower with a hollowed-out manufacturing base, large trade deficit, and growing debt held heavily by other countries. Households have propped themselves up in the face of falling real wages by maxing out hours, credit cards, and home equity loans. This is not a suitable course. The low road is like a shortcut that leads to a cliff. We have fallen off the cliff. Margaret Sims writes in her article, Government Programs Should Be More Tailored to America's Poor, that, quote, the time has come for us to civilize ourselves by the total. Direct and immediate abolition of poverty. She explains how America's poverty, according to the Census Bureau, is 12.5%. To bring it up to date, it is currently at 16.8%, and that 1/3 of children in America lives in poverty. And in this case, those born into these families living in poverty are already at a disadvantage to not only make a living in society, but largely out of this basis is a very hard place to grapple themselves out of the poverty they were born into. Poor children lack access to services and opportunities needed to move up the economic ladder when they reach adulthood unless the public sector provides access. And as the regularly used catchphrase, "our next generation," is used, we must heed to Sim's words in that clearly any strategy for reducing poverty in the long run must reach children. It is, in my view, the biggest issue we cannot ignore. To raise our next generation in poverty, and the rate continues to grow daily, is letting us see directly into the future that our own path is leading to a spiral of non-control of society, a degradation of our country, an unethical quagmire. I propose it does, and blatantly so. We can make excuses for the elderly, the middle-aged, and even veterans, but our own children, born into this state, should be so appalling that we would allow that nonetheless tolerate it and let it continue to rise. It is thus important that we grow and create programs to enrich our current and future generations' growth, not only by humanitarian standpoints, but for the hope of success in our country's economic growth and stability. If we continue to rise in poverty, leading to less purchasing, leading to less jobs, and to spiral on and go, we see not a growth but a spike, and then a plunge into decline that could be bad enough to destroy an economy beyond repair. Though I hate to make a standpoint in regards to ethics and be placed to argue for the fact due to simple money, but since we live in a democratic, capitalist society in the United States of America, I find it only fair that we accept and not reject this aspect, if for nothing else than to embrace the society and culture we have created. In conclusion, the above minute changes are only two I found to be the most important and prominent and impending in beginning the restoration of our poverty-stricken into the whole of society again. There are many, many more ways and actions to do, which are immediately attainable if the correct elected officials were in place with an ethical mindset and a standard such as set by using the ethical toolbox. These are not suggestions that are outrageous or completely going against the grain, in a sense, but are only a step away in beginning the change. But until we as society decide to accept and acknowledge the reality currently in place and what lies ahead, we will see no change come to benefit. The philosopher John Rawls, in his work Justice as Fairness, lays a groundwork that I believe is essential in starting the process of the above stated change. He expounds upon the point of justice and fairness is to be coined and combined into a constitutional democracy. It is the basic structure that we must first instate before we can see positive progress take place. It is in this democracy in which are set the main pillars of political, social, and economic institutions. Do not assume that Mr. Rawls believes this to be easy. He acknowledges that looking at history of even our American society, we see fundamental questions being raised to only end with political controversies, difficulties, and mindsets that seem to be impossible to overcome, especially to overcome in strong enough ways to come to a political agreement. But nevertheless, it is not our place to throw in the towel. It is imperative we see each citizen, each person, as equally right to liberties and inequalities only be in the case of a person's office or position, and only these inequalities are in a right sense if they bring the greater benefit to society as a whole. It is, and should be emphasized, that it is of the utmost importance for citizens of society to publicly examine issues before one another and come to the conclusion whether it is of political or social institution, and if it be the just nature, it is because the citizens are, quote, a free and equal persons, that we must hold fast and begin the dialogue to re-examine our national morals and ethics. With millions living in poverty, unable to even bring food to the table for their children, and many living on the streets, we have far outreached our ethical limits to continue to stand as moral. To have such wealth in this country and yet at the other end such relinquishing poverty, there is no moral justifiable excuse. We can no longer claim there is nothing we can do when the opposite is blatantly true. We need not continue to play a game with words to cover up our selfish motives and release that selfishness for the betterment of not only our fellow human beings, not only our fellow citizens, but for the security of our country's economical, democratic, and political soundness. As I write these final words on the eve of another devastating mass shooting in our country, I find it interesting and appropriate to use a single word that is being thrown around. Bold pictures of a black background encompassed by a 6-letter word in white print are swirling around the internet. Although I am speaking of a different subject, it is ironically appropriate, the final statement and final words to be left in regards to the astounding poverty and humanitarian crisis in our own backyard. It is a simple word, a word most English speakers will know, and if not, easily explained or looked into with a dictionary. In regards to American poverty, enough.